Okay, what we're going to do today is kind of answer a video called Homosexuality and the Bible. This is put out by a guy named Dr. Josh. He's PhD at Hopkins. He's following a professor, Adan Dershowitz from Harvard, that has put out an article a while ago, a couple years ago, dealing with the issue of homosexuality, where he had kind of a unique argument to it. Now, this is kind of typical among liberalism, liberal Bible scholarship. I personally think that liberal Bible scholarship is an apologetic for the Enlightenment and for the Enlightenment cult. And so these guys are just so driven by it. They tend to make arguments that, to me, are not scholarship at all. I'll talk about that a bit as we go through. And arguments that are illogical, which is what we're going to get today from this one. It's going to be extremely illogical, and the entire argument will be based in a logical fallacy. So let's go ahead and start it. We can kind of see where they're going to go.
There's a lot of attention today being focused on homosexuality and the Bible, and what does the Bible say about same-sex relationships? A lot of people have taken some interesting views on the subject.
No homos will ever be allowed on this church as long as I'm the pastor here.
Now, I want you to notice, like, this whole thing, like, getting Steven Anderson is kind of your foil. This, to me, is what proves liberal scholarship tends to be an apologetic for the Enlightenment, and it's not actually scholarship. If you were doing scholarship, you wouldn't appeal to garbage like this. And yet, when I tune in to a lecture given, at Yale Divinity School over a biblical book, it's typically the dumbest arguments that are used to counter liberalism, so that these liberal scholars feel justified, like, we're the smart ones and these dumb religious primitive people are just trying to argue for their holy book and all that sort of thing. If you really wanted to do scholarship, you would take scholars, you wouldn't do this low-hanging fruit, you would actually take scholars who had a sophisticated argument using, good exegetical methods, and see if you can refute that. But that's not what's happening, because liberal scholarship doesn't have good exegetical methods for the most part. They have essentially a speculative method because they need to support their religion, which is not the religion of the Bible. And so of course, they think that they're completely objective, that they don't belong to a cult. How dare you suggest otherwise? But it very clearly is a cult, and it's no surprise that they all land in the same place. That's what cults do. You might have a different argument to get there, but ultimately you get there because they're starting with the same metaphysic and epistemology, and it's gonna be the same methodologies then, and end in the same conclusions. And that's typically what happens. And so you're gonna see that here today. But let's get further into it.
Never!
Yeah. Inevitably, this discussion turns back to passages from the Bible that seem to speak either indirectly or very explicitly to the subject of homosexuality. One of the primary passages that we see is Leviticus chapter 18. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, recently, Dr. Adan Dershowitz has written an article taking a drastically different approach to the passage there in Leviticus 18. According to his reanalysis of the passage, which I'm authorized to summarize, by the way, we have a drastically different understanding of what the text originally said.
Now, I want you to notice this. This is a bait and switch. This video is called The Bible and Homosexuality, and that he's looking at the passage and reevaluating the passage. Well, I want you to notice, no, he's not. He's not going to do exegesis of this passage. He's not looking at the passage again. What he's doing instead is he's going to reconstruct the passage based on his speculation in order to make a different Bible that condones homosexuality. That's not the Bible in homosexuality. That's the made-up speculative Bible of liberalism, the Bible that supposedly was before the Bible. This idea in liberal scholarship that you have, because you have this long textual tradition, you can somehow discover what was said in the text before. This is like half the commentaries in liberalism, or even their exegetical commentaries. Even they've got to include this stuff. You get critiqued if you don't speculate till the cows come home on what you think the Bible originally said and which sources it goes to and all that sort of thing. Even though when pressed on it, liberal scholars themselves don't know, they can't conclude definitively on these things. It's just a matter of it's part of the cult. And you've got to believe it if you're going to be considered like the smart guy, the smart scholar versus some religious fanatic or something. So, you're not going to get the Bible, what the Bible says on homosexuality. In fact, what he just read of Leviticus 18:22, that's pretty much what the Bible does say about homosexuality. So you already knew that if you know the Bible at all. But you don't know this new made-up Bible that Dershowitz is coming up with. And so that's what we're going to hear about today.
So let's take a look at the passage in Leviticus 18 itself, Dr. Dershowitz's argument, and what that would mean for our understanding of this critical passage.
What would it mean? What would it mean for our understanding of the passage? That maybe before it actually was the Bible, there may have been an author or a source or something. Maybe the passage that wasn't the Bible said something different. You get this argument as well when it comes to like child sacrifice and whether the Israelites believed in multiple gods or worshiped multiple gods. And it's like, let's say all your hopes and dreams come true as a liberal, and you find that the original sources that went into the Bible, they were all that. They were the Israelites sacrificing their kids, and that original text condoned it and was even teaching it. And you should worship other gods, and it was fine with homosexuality. Let's say it was even part of the daily practice of the Israelites to practice homosexuality. It's not the Bible, and we understand the religion of Israel is filled with probably all of that. That doesn't mean anything, because once an author gets a hold of it, and we of course believe in the Orthodox Church in divine inspiration, but even if you didn't believe in that, once an author gets a hold of it, and we're talking about the Bible as we have it, what does the Bible as we have it teach? Once they get a hold of that source and they change it, and they change it even to the point where it condemns what came before, then you're no longer talking about, it's no longer a question of what it said before. Because if you view as what the author says now as the work that you're looking at that we call the Bible, or the book of Leviticus in this case, or even the Holiness Code, whatever you want to do, that's what it says now. So when you say something like, well, the Bible actually condones homosexuality, that's actually a lie. The Bible doesn't condone homosexuality, it condemns it. Now, maybe your speculative pre-Bible thing of whatever you think it may have said, maybe that condoned homosexuality, but no Christian in the history of the church considers that authoritative. That's the equivalent, that's an etymological fallacy. It's the equivalent of saying that every meaning of a word that came before the way that the Bible uses that word has to be considered just as authoritative. That has to be considered the Bible too. That's absurd. Absolutely absurd. It's nonsense. You know that's foolish because James Barr and all the linguistic lexical works that have been done since then condemning that etymological approach when it comes to words. Well, it's the same thing when it comes to sources or whatever you think the Bible may have been before it became the Bible. It really doesn't matter. And now I'm not conceding that it originally said that. I'm just saying that let's say for a moment that it did, and all your hopes and dreams come true. It still doesn't inform our understanding of the passage as it stands in the Bible and what the Bible says about homosexuality. This is just bad logic, which I expect, again, from some guy who was a fundamentalist and turned into a liberal within an hour and a half of going to, college and finding out, what liberals believe about the historicity of the Bible or something. So I just think, this is just typical. And, I apologize if I'm being a little snarky with it. I just think it's frustrating because I've grown up in this and I've been in it for so long, and I don't see it as scholarship. It's a religion pretending to be academic.
About homosexuality in the Bible. Leviticus 18 contains a list of statutes against certain types of male sexual union. Most of them involve laws against having sexual relations with people in your own family. None of you shall approach anyone who is near of kin to him to uncover his nakedness. I am the Lord. The nakedness of your father or the nakedness of your mother you shall not uncover. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. The nakedness of your father's wife you shall not uncover. It is your father's nakedness. The nakedness of your sister, the daughter of your father, or the daughter of your mother, whether born at home or elsewhere, their nakedness you shall not uncover. It's in this context that we find this specific statute against male same-sex relations. So the basic structure of the passage is the phrase, the nakedness of X, you shall not uncover. Do not uncover. This idea of uncovering nakedness has to do with sexual relations of some kind. But the main point here is that uncovering the nakedness of someone is sexual interaction of some kind. In this passage, it appears pretty straightforward. A man is not supposed to have sexual relations with people in his own family. Makes sense, right? The problem is there are some difficulties with certain aspects of the passage. For example, in verses 12, 13, and 14 you read, do not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister. Do not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister. Do not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. That's a problem. The problem is that the verses didn't stop with just that first section. There's a second part to each verse. So when the first part of the verse says, do not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister, the second part says, she is your father's blood relative. The same with your mother's sister. She is your mother's blood relative. The problem comes in verse 14 because it says, do not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. Do not approach his wife. She is your aunt. So it's a striking difference between what came before and what came in verse 14.
Now, this reminds me of, I don't know if you've ever spoken to someone who's a cult member, like a Mormon or something that wants to undermine the Bible, or someone who's like a Muslim or something. There are difficulties in the Bible where you can say, oh, well, this seems like it contradicts or whatever. And, there's, reasons for it. We can discuss what those reasons are. And those are legitimate discussions. You know that you're dealing with a cult that has an agenda and is trying to make an apologetic when they look for errors when there aren't any. When they look for things, they're like, whoa, that just sounds weird. There must be something going on there. I guess that must be some source that added something. There must be an editor there that added to the text or whatever. I want you to notice there's nothing untoward about it, just because you have variation. You've got variation in this text regardless. But I want you to notice, so verse 12, do not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister. She is your father's blood relative. What's it functioning on? It's functioning off of the two become one flesh, the one flesh union. That's why, I would argue, I'm going to use some, terminology of source terminology for a minute. This is typically the holiness code, and so it's referred to as H, meaning it's the holiness school or the author. I'm going to refer to him as an author. I believe the same author that wrote this wrote Genesis. I have argued that before. I've had other scholars who agree with me that it's H, or what would be called H or whatever. And that there's an assumption of the one flesh union in this. In fact, that there's an assumption that procreation is the foundational principle of why these things are being argued against. I've argued that before. I've never heard anyone really be able to rebut that. There's an idea of the one flesh union, which is why it says, don't uncover the nakedness of your father's sister. She is your father's blood relative. Because ultimately there's a connection with the blood. They're kinsmen. When you uncover, literally the verse he read before, which he's not actually talking about, it says not to uncover your father, the nakedness of your father. And it says that is the nakedness of your mother. It is your mother. And so the idea is that you're not literally sleeping with your dad; you would be sleeping with your mom. And then it's don't uncover the nakedness of your father's wife, referring to if he were to marry someone else and this is your stepmother. Why? Because it's the nakedness of your father. So the idea is that the two become one flesh. There's nothing out of line with that whatsoever. It reads normally, understanding that whole concept. These guys don't seem to be reading it like that, and because of that, they're ignoring what the passage itself seems to indicate. What it really actually implies, they're ignoring. So, do not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. Do not approach his wife; she is your aunt. So that's the idea, is that ultimately you're uncovering the nakedness of your father's brother, not because you're sleeping with your uncle, but because you're sleeping with your aunt, and she is one with your uncle. Again, I just think there's a problem with the whole reasoning here of why, at the very get-go, why there would be a need of, or thinking that there's redaction or something. And of course, the logic, the reason that supposedly there's a redaction is the most illogical thing I've ever heard. We're yet to get to that.
This is a problem because it doesn't make sense in the passage. What comes in the second part of the verse completely negates and changes what came in the first part.
That's like saying what came in the second part of she is your mother negates uncovering the nakedness of your father. Of course it doesn't. Do not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. That is your uncle. Well, what is the nakedness of your uncle? Literally your uncle? No, it's talking about his wife, just like all the other ones are talking about sleeping with the woman. Which, by the way, I agree with Jacob Milgrom in his commentary. This is all talking to men about not sleeping with women relatives, not men. So there's no assumption of homosexuality even in the incest here, like they're going to argue. And that verse 6 is actually talking about any relative at all, but seems to be through the fact that you're sleeping with the wives of these relatives, not that a man is sleeping with another man in any of them. So this whole thing to me is completely bogus. And I agree with Milgrom. Milgrom never heard this argument. But he probably would roll over in his grave hearing it. It doesn't accord with what's going on in the passage. I think it's just misunderstood.
The first part of the verse, it says, don't have sex with your uncle. By making the statement, do not approach his wife, she is your aunt, it's saying that when it says, don't uncover the nakedness of your uncle, what it really means is, don't sleep with your aunt. The problem,
which is what the entire passage has been saying, that ultimately if you sleep with the wife of someone, or you sleep with the daughter of someone, you're sleeping with the male counterpart who's connected to that person, whether it be even if you're sleeping with your sister, well, that's a blood relative. She's your sister, so she's connected to you through blood. She's connected to your father through blood. It's that idea. You're not to be sleeping with these people.
The problem is that doesn't make sense in the passage. For one, it changes the meaning completely from the first part of the verse to the second. And secondly, it changes the meaning of the phrase to uncover the nakedness.
It doesn't. So, again, it does not change the meaning of the first part if you understand that the first part isn't literal, just like the rest of it. When it started out, you will not uncover the nakedness of your father. That is speaking the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. That's not negating the idea of you don't sleep with your it's not the opposite of you don't sleep with your father. The idea is that ultimately not sleeping with your father means not sleeping with your mother. Now, if the argument wants to be made that it's all changed, that originally it was just that first part and all of these other things were added, that's fine. Again, there's nothing to say that wasn't the original text, that wasn't the original author's intent to do so. It's just strange to get this argument on this particular verse as though it's different than the rest of the reasoning of the passage.
Now it has to mean something different in one place and something different in another. within the same passage, which is a lexical difficulty. Another
It
problem
really
comes in
isn't.
verse 7. Do not uncover the nakedness of your father and the nakedness of your mother. But the second part of the verse says, she is your mother. You are not to uncover her nakedness. Well,
Right.
that's strange because it said, don't uncover the nakedness of your father and your mother. But
Which
then
is
in
the
the
nakedness
second
of
part
the
of the
mother.
verse, it leaves the father out completely and says, what I meant was just your mom. The endings to verses 14 and 7 pose great difficulty in this context because
They really don't. And again, look, it's just trying to find a reason to justify in the end. Look, it's all working to the conclusion that homosexuality is okay. But it's trying to find some sort of reason to justify this speculative reconstruction of the Bible to where, well, it originally said this, which I just argued it really doesn't matter if you were able to establish that anyway. It doesn't actually do anything toward our understanding of the Bible. But I want you to notice that again, because these guys don't have the concept of the one flesh union, they're just misinterpreting the entire passage and thinking that these things are added and it doesn't make sense.
they either change the meaning of uncover the nakedness, which is the key part of this passage, or it completely changes the meaning of the first part of the verse. Interestingly enough, it does this in the two verses that talk about male same-sex relationships, sleeping with the father, sleeping with the uncle. In both cases, you have a second part of the verse that completely changes the meaning of the first part so that it only means a female relative. Well, why would this be? Why would the first part of a verse be changed by the second part of it?
Well, because all of it is about females. The whole passage is about female relatives and their connections to, the males as well, but or other people that are your kinsmen. But the idea is that it's a male initiating sexuality with a female in the family somehow. So, I mean, again, it makes perfect sense in the passage.
Of the verse. Dr. Dershowitz's argument is that a later redactor came back to this passage, which originally just said, do not uncover the nakedness of your father and of your mother and of your uncle, and said, well, that implicitly allows male same-sex relationships. So he added these extra portions to the text to clarify what the original text meant. In other words, originally, he argues, the text allowed for male same-sex relationships. There are many places in the ancient Near East which either implicitly or explicitly condone homosexuality.
Okay, so there's a few things there. Notice the logical reasoning. So the whole reasoning this was supposedly changed was because when it said don't uncover the nakedness of your father or don't uncover the nakedness of your uncle, that implicitly meant it was okay to uncover the nakedness of any other male. That's the argument. Now, I want you to think about that because he finds it really convincing. Obviously, Dershowitz thinks it's convincing. Think about that for a moment. And they give the analogy of it's implicit in the phrase that we don't serve breakfast before 10, that you do serve breakfast before 10. Now, one of the problems with biblical scholars is that they don't actually learn logic. Logic's not a part of the curriculum in any program I know of. If you learn logic, you probably went outside your program to do that. It is not implicit, even in that phrase, that we would normally think that that's a good argument because we're all familiar with McDonald's, right? McDonald's usually said that, and we're like, oh, well, that means it implies that you serve breakfast beforehand. The logical statement actually doesn't imply that. That's not logical. We just know through further context that that's what McDonald's means. And I'll prove this to you by giving you different scenarios that show you that simply a prohibition on one thing does not imply that it's okay for you to do anything else within that category, as long as you're not prohibiting that one category. Don't hit your sister does not imply you're free to wail on your brother. Take out the garbage does not imply that that's the only chore you need to do, and therefore you're free to do whatever you want. Don't play video games on Saturday does not imply you're free to play video games for the rest of the time, or any other time. I only eat biscuits from 11, or no, let me say it this way. I don't eat anything from 11 p.m. to midnight. That does not imply that I eat something every other hour. The idea that somehow that there's an implicit allowance in a specific prohibition that doesn't prohibit any of those allowances is an absurdity. That is not logical. Again, in the very command to not sleep with your mom, did the author of Leviticus not get that implies you can actually have an adulterous affair with anyone else? Is that argument being made? Because your mom's married to your dad. That would be adultery as well. Oh no. Now you've just allowed for adultery because you just said not to actually commit adultery with your mom. But now your mom or your dad. But now you can go out and I guess commit adultery with everybody else. So the Bible originally condoned adultery. And then they're going to make this argument that, well, in the ancient Near East, a lot of people accepted homosexuality. The very point of Leviticus 18 it forms an inclusio with this point, that you're not to actually practice what they practiced in Egypt, nor what they practiced in Canaan. In other words, you're not to practice what the surrounding nations practice or the nation that are being vomited out of this land practice. So we all agree, yes, the nations, the pagans, do practice homosexuality. That's the point of, the Bible makes that point numerous times, all the way to Romans 1, that's the sin of the Gentiles, the sin of people who are not of God. So absolutely, 100%, I agree. Homosexuality is practiced by the surrounding nations. Fine. Is adultery practiced by the surrounding nations? Because everyone condemns adultery. Yet you would have to actually make that same implicit argument and say, well, because it says to just not, have an adulterous affair with your mom and your dad, you're free to have an adulterous affair with anyone else. Well, no, that would not have been accepted in the ancient Near East, and so it wouldn't have been implied. No one would have understood it that way. Don't sleep with your neighbor's wife does not imply it's okay to sleep with everyone's wife who's not your neighbor. It's emphasizing the neighbor for a particular reason, but it's not saying, yeah, go ahead and sleep with the wives of people who are not your neighbor. Again, it's an absurdity. It's not logical. And the entire argument is built on this non sequitur. And so I just want you to notice, but this is being swallowed wholesale because, again, they like the conclusion. No one would have accepted this argument if the end result was homosexuality is condemned by the Bible. It's only being accepted because they think they're getting to a conclusion that, the Bible's okay with homosexuality. It even condones it, because it condones it by saying, just don't sleep with this particular group of people. Again, that's nonsense.
For example, Dr. Dershowitz cites Hittite laws. If a man has sexual relations with his own mother, it is an unpermitted sexual pairing. If a man has sexual relations with his own daughter, it is an unpermitted sexual pairing. If a man has sexual relations with his own son, it is an unpermitted sexual pairing. The Hittitologist Harry Hoffner, analyzing this passage, says, a man who sodomizes his own son is guilty of herkel because his partner is his son, not because they are of the same sex. In other words, if Leviticus 18 originally condoned male same-sex relationships, this would not be out of character with the broader ancient Near East. Well,
now, I do want you to notice, so I think they practice this in the ancient Near East. There are laws, like, for instance, if you sodomize someone, you end up being sodomized. It's not seen as a great thing. It's kind of seen as dirty and all that sort of thing. But I want you to notice they did with the Hittite laws exactly what they did with Leviticus. The idea that because incest is condemned, that somehow allows for non-incestuous homosexuality. And therefore, hey, look, since the Hittites condoned it, and even the quote from Harry Hoffner is probably the major Hittite scholar or whatever in ancient Near Eastern studies. But even what he said, he didn't say it condoned homosexuality. He just said that the laws they're not talking about homosexuality. It's not because they're male to male. It's because they're related. Now, again, I don't know if he went on to say something else. I didn't read the article that he quoted there. But it would still be a logical fallacy even if Harry Hoffner said it, because again, it's not that it's not a logical argument either way. But notice that that's the sum total of evidence there from the ancient Near East, even that they're trying to muster.
But what's the conclusion here? Dr. Dershowitz argues that the text originally allowed for male same-sex relationship. If a store were to put out a sign that says, "We don't serve breakfast after 10 a.m., implicitly they are saying that before 10 a.m., they do serve breakfast.
See, again, no, that's not true. These guys need to learn logic. It's not the case. You can put together other factors and add it to that and then say, oh, okay, well, now I know they serve breakfast before 10, and that can imply it within that context. But simply saying we don't serve breakfast after 10 a.m., it could possibly mean that we don't serve breakfast after 10 a.m. because we don't serve breakfast. Maybe someone's asking, hey, maybe someone comes up and asks the question, hey, do you serve breakfast after 10 a.m.? And someone says no. Why? Is it because they serve it before, or is it because they don't serve it at all? Again, you need other factors to understand the implicitness. What is more akin to it is what I gave you. The equivalent of someone saying to their son, stop hitting your sister, does not mean he's free to hit every other sibling or anyone else. That's not the point. That's not the way prohibitions work. That's not the way logic works, or logical statements in terms of propositions. You don't make a proposition and suddenly, because it limits the proposition to one thing, it therefore it's implicitly allowing for everything outside of it.
The passage in Leviticus 18 originally would have said same-sex couplings are fine, just not these same-sex couplings. In the same way,
see, again, this is so what it originally would have said. It was based on this logical fallacy that these guys are making. No, it wouldn't have. There's no substantiation for that. The logic is fallacious. There's no textual evidence for it. The very idea that somehow, well, this doesn't make sense and therefore there's a reconstruction is also bogus. And so there's absolutely no basis whatsoever, and yet it's being spoken dogmatically that, oh no, the Bible would have condoned it.
That you may have sexual relations with another woman, just not these women, your mother, your sister, your aunt, and so on.
That's not the logical implication. These women, most of them are actually married, like your mother to your father, or like your aunt to your uncle. So it's not just don't have sexual relations with these women, but you're free to have with other women. You would have to say then, don't have adulterous affairs with these particular women, but you're free to with other people. Don't have adulterous affairs with these men, if you want to say the originals were talking about men, but it's okay to have adulterous affairs with other. That would not have been accepted. I mean, of course, adultery is not involving men in the ancient Near East, but in terms of married men.
But what we have, according to Dr. Dershowitz, is a later redactor coming back in the Persian period, late in the first millennium, seeing this Leviticus 18 section and saying, no, we cannot allow for homosexuality to be condoned in this way, and added these second parts to several of the verses.
Now, I don't know when these guys think that Leviticus or this originally was said or whatever. I think Leviticus is written much later, and therefore, like when he's talking about when the redactor would have come in, I actually think it's when it's written. And so because of that, again, I see no warrant whatsoever to have some sort of later redactor who I think is actually the author at the time.
Particularly those that talk about sleeping with one's father and sleeping with one's uncle, in order to clarify, to completely change the meaning of the first part of the verse. Dr. Dershowitz, in his article, gives the example of a shop down the street from his home. It is called the Wine and Cheese Cask. If a researcher, an archaeologist, would find that sign during an excavation 1,000 years from now and read the Wine and Cheese Cask, they might ask, should we be looking for a cask that holds cheese? No, originally the sign only said the wine cask. When they began to sell cheese, they added and cheese. In the same way, the text originally said, "You shall not have sex with your mother and your father." And later, a redactor came back and said, "What I mean by that is, don't have sex with your mother."
So the analogy, these false analogies are amazing. So you would know, because cheese doesn't come in a cask, that there was something added there. That'd be great. You don't have the same thing in Leviticus 18. There's nothing in Leviticus 18 that doesn't make sense. They want it to not make sense because they don't see the whole one flesh union thing happening. They want it to sound like, oh, well, liberals are great with this. Well, it would have been said this way. If you ever have someone say that, like, it would have been said this way instead of this way, that's nonsense. There's variation in writing, variation within authors, all that sort of thing. There's nothing to say that this isn't the original author. It's just the desire to make an argument that condones homosexuality. That's the only reason this exists. It does not make sense any other way.
The text originally said, "Don't have sex with your uncle." A later redactor came and said, "What I meant by that was, don't have sex with your uncle, that is, to approach his wife." A later redactor changed this passage, according to Dr. Dershowitz' conclusions, in order to clarify and change the meaning and the implicit condoning of homosexuality in Leviticus.
Okay, what I wanted to do is kind of look at the passage, since we're talking about it, and point something that I think is extremely important, that shows that, again, even if I bought into the whole thing of the redaction, that this is not a place where it would be redacted. In fact, the very argumentation that's being given that supposedly means that there was a need of redaction here, I think has ignored something that's extremely important. So I alluded to it a little bit earlier, but I'll be more explicit. So I just want you to, we'll go through the passage real quick. Man to man, this is the idea of any man whatsoever in relationship to a blood relative, so of his own flesh, so flesh of his own flesh, is not to draw near to uncover the nakedness. So the nakedness, of course, is referring to the nakedness of the blood relative. This is a general statement, as I said before. I agree with Milgram here that verse 6 is actually a summary statement, that basically you're not to sleep with anyone who's a blood relative at all, and which would include anyone who's a blood relative in terms of the one flesh union. And of course, that's the idea that the whole passage is functioning off of. The nakedness of your father, and this is a disjunctive vav. It could be or your mother, but given the rest of the context, it is that is describing the nakedness of your mother. So the nakedness of your father is described as the nakedness of your mother. Of course, this is what they're contending is added, because in reality they think that the logic of it is that the original command was just about the nakedness of the father, not sleeping with your father or something. So the nakedness of your father, that is the nakedness of your mother, you will not uncover. She is your mother. So you will not uncover her nakedness. Now, I want you to notice, and this is the same thing for when it talks about the uncle. I mentioned before that the commands are given to the male. The reason why the commands are given to the male is because the male is in authority. He's the one who would initiate the sexual act because he's the one in authority. He's the stronger one in the relationship when it comes to a male-female relationship. And that's every male-female relationship. He's physically stronger, and we're talking about adult males here. We're not talking about children. So adult males, they would have more power in the family. They would have more, all of that. Here's what's being missed by Dershowitz and Dr. Josh here. If the command is being given to the male because he has the authority, he's the one that initiates, the original command, quote unquote, that they're trying to argue for would not have been commanding a male who is the son of a father to not sleep with his father. It would not have been commanding a male who is the nephew of an uncle to not sleep with his uncle. And the reason why is because in that relationship, the father actually would have the authority. So the command would have gone to the father not to sleep with his son. The command would have gone to the uncle not to sleep with his nephew. And you see this switch when there's a switch of authority as you go down in Leviticus. We go down here a little bit, and sorry, my computer's a little bit slow. And you have this command not to sleep with an animal. It suddenly is a command that's given to a woman, that a woman's not to actually put herself in front of the animal. Why? Because the woman has more of authority than the animal, obviously. So now you have a switch in voice. It's not just commanding don't sleep with an animal. It's actually, when it comes to the woman sleeping with an animal, then it's on the woman. She's not to stand before an animal and to sleep with it. And so this is important because the original command then is not about the son not sleeping with the father and the nephew not sleeping with the uncle, because it would not have been said that way. If you want to make the it would not have said that way argument, that in reality is true given the logic of the passage, and we know the way the commands are given in the holiness code here. So in reality, there is no reason to suggest that there was a redaction because the command would have been given to the father. It only makes sense that the original command was given to the son because it's talking about the woman in the original command. It's talking about not sleeping with the mother, who's a woman. So in that relationship, the adult son actually has more power in the family. He actually has more authority. He's actually stronger in that regard. So it makes sense that the command would be going to him, the male, in the original command. It makes no sense for the original command to be going to the son not sleeping with his dad. That destroys the whole logic of it, that the responsibility is primarily on the one with authority and who's stronger or whatever. Again, completely ignored by this whole argument. And so again, even if I wasn't a Christian and I was a total atheistic liberal scholar, I would absolutely say, no, this is bogus scholarship. It's not genuine. You guys have missed the whole point of the passage. You've missed the underlying idea of the one flesh union. You've missed the idea that this is given to males who are in authority, and so it's always the person in authority who the command is directed to first. And this, therefore, I think, without reasonable doubt, otherwise, that the original command, we're looking at the original command, that nothing was actually added. The original command actually did have to do with their wives, because in fact, and not the actual men. So it had nothing to do with homosexual relationships. There was nothing about homosexuality or any sort of prohibition about homosexual relationships here in the incest laws at all. And therefore, there was nothing about condemning it, and there was nothing about condoning it. The condemnation of the homosexual law comes down in verse 22. As you can see here, with a male, you will not lie with, bed, in the same way as bedding a woman. It is an abomination, the toeva. And so, again, there's your prohibition right there. There's no need to add it, because it was part of the original commands, because the whole logic of Leviticus 18 is that these are non-procreative things. It has to do with children. That's why the adultery law is explained in terms of you're not to give your semen to seed as an offspring into your neighbor's wife. It's a very different way of describing adultery than just a possession issue. It's actually talking about the children. That's why in the middle of this, you have the whole thing of you're not to actually give your children over to Molech. again, the same type of reasoning could be used that, well, but you can give your children over to Baal. And it's like, no, that's not the point. Yeah. Again, the whole idea that because you have a prohibition against something, that's some, it's only that specific thing that's prohibited and everything else is allowed. That's just nonsense. That it doesn't follow. And so the whole reasoning of this article that is published, and the fame that it got and the adoption that it's getting and everything, is completely bogus. It's not real scholarship. It's been accepted, and this is where you get peer review, which becomes a joke, because peer review is that you have the right views. It has nothing to do with whether or not you had good scholarship in your argument. And, maybe people missed it, whatever. I mean, I just think there's tons here to miss. But at the end of the day, the logic of the passage only makes sense, like I said, because the logic is the person in power is being commanded to not have sex with someone who has less power. That's not going to be the dad. The dad actually has more power. The uncle has more power. It makes no sense then that it would be given to someone in lesser power. That's not the logic of the passage. You don't have that anywhere else in the passage. And you wouldn't. It usually comes to the person who actually has the ability to do it, the power, in this text. So again, that means that the original command had to do not with homosexual sex with the father or the uncle, that the original command had to do with exactly the way you read it today in the text, with sleeping with the wife of the father, specifically your mother, or the wife of the uncle, that is your aunt. That is what is the nakedness to your father. That's the pattern you see throughout. That makes total sense. There's no sense, no rhyme or reason whatsoever to assume that there's any sort of redaction here. Again, that has been fabricated as an apologetic for a basically a liberal ethic about homosexuality that stems from Enlightenment views. Again, we're getting the cult of the Enlightenment, and that's what you get in liberal biblical scholarship. You don't get actual honest exegesis. Liberals don't exegete; they rip the text apart, make up their own Bible, and then they give you exegesis from that. And so that's what we're getting. And it's unfortunate, but that's just the way that it works, essentially. So I think that's sufficient to get the argument. He's almost done anyway. I think it's important to understand, again, that this is being said dogmatic. Look at how much this is taught as though this is fact. This is typical liberal scholarship. This idea that I'm going to speculate on what the Bible may have said beforehand, and I'm going to create what I think the Bible was before, or the source said before, or whatever, and then I'm going to come out to conservatives and say, "Oh, well, your Bible, it originally said something different, and you have no confidence that this is actually the Word of God, because look, it said something different. Didn't you know that?" Again, this is a logical fallacy. It's an etymological fallacy when it comes to methodologies of study. Liberal scholarship has not gotten that yet. They have not applied the etymological fallacy that James Barr was noting in his works when it came to lexicography to larger scholarship, because it would erase liberal scholarship. It would erase all of this nonsense. This is completely irrelevant to what the Bible currently says. And as I said before, it's an implicit admission that the Bible you have condemns homosexuality. It's why we have to make up some other Bible, some pre-Bible that's completely speculative, in order to get a Bible that condones it. So I actually am thankful for arguments like this, because it exposes what people think is, oh, in the academy, they must have just great arguments that are going on. And us poor primitive religious people who believe in, superstition and all of that, we just can't handle these arguments. And it's like, no, this is what they argue. This is it. This is the stuff that you're going to get. It's based on nonsense. And so
I'm sorry, this argument is just completely asinine. It in no way is this logical. In no way is there evidence for it at all. In no way is this even a proper understanding of, if I were to rip the text apart or whatever in the way that they have, is it even an understanding of that supposed original text, that somehow it would imply that homosexuality is okay? So again, this is just an apologetic. It's not a good one for Enlightenment religion that eventually we get to acceptance of things like homosexuality and transgenderism and all of that, all the liberal ethics that come forth from Enlightenment religion. That's all this is, and that's the way you need to treat the Academy. The Academy is a cult. It is not some neutral, objective people doing research and they're just trying to get the facts down. That's not what the Academy is. It is trying to make arguments for positions, for religions, for worldviews that they believe in, and they're largely rooted in, of course, the Enlightenment thinking. Regardless of what branch of the Enlightenment you may get, in the end, it's going to have its source in that worldview. So I hope that this was helpful in some way. You're going to get a lot of arguments. We didn't deal with, there are tons more arguments we can deal with and look at how they're illogical. A lot of arguments that deal with the homosexual issue are committing lexical fallacies. But they didn't present that here today, so I didn't bother with it. Instead, it's more of a type of etymological fallacy that you see in words, but in here it's applied to entire texts. But again, the bait and switch of the Bible and homosexuality, you did not get anything about the Bible and homosexuality from this video. You simply got a lot about a speculative pre-source thing that may have become the Bible at some point, but you didn't get the Bible and homosexuality because the Bible clearly condemns it. As we can read, anyone can read, and you don't need an interpreter or anyone who understands Hebrew to get that. So I hope it was helpful, and we'll try to do more of these if we can. All right. We'll see you later.